everybody. Welcome to the first reading of the book Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. We're going to start with the preface because it's just very important and interesting. And so let's go. This volume is the outgrowth of a series of articles dealing with incidents in my life which were published consecutively in The Outlook. I guess that was a newspaper back in the time. While they were appearing in that magazine, I was constantly surprised at the number of requests which came to me from all parts of the country asking that the articles be permanently preserved in book form. I am most grateful to the Outlook for permission to gratify those requests. I have tried to tell a simple, straightforward story with no attempt at embellishment. My regret is that what I have attempted to do has been done so imperfectly. The greater part of my time and strength is required for the executive work connected with the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute and in securing the money necessary for the support of the institution. Much of what I have said has been written on board trains or at hotels or railroad stations while I have been waiting for trains or during the moments that I could spare from my work while at Tuskegee. Without the painstaking and generous assistance of Mr. Max Bennett Thrasher, I could not have succeeded in any satisfactory degree. Here's the introduction. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the eyes of that portion of mankind which constituted the lower classes of Europe and Asia looked to the developing new nations in North America and saw freedom and opportunity there. All around, feudalism was beginning to suffer its final death throes, but its oppression, its grinding poverty, its political restrictions bore down on men more than ever. So one by one, family by family, the oppressed and poor of Europe, and some from Asia, uprooted themselves and made their painful way to the New World. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Thus sang the poet of the New World, and her words shone brightly from the colossal figure in New York Harbor, which looked toward Europe and became the symbol for the hopes and aspirations of the 25 million people who emigrated to the United States from 1800 to 1910. In their new home, they often found themselves in ghettos, not unlike those of the old world, and for many, poverty remained a fact of life. Yet there were differences. A man could vote. There were all those vast lands to the west, and there a man could become his own master. Nuggets of gold littered the watercourses of Colorado and California. Moreover, there was opportunity. Abraham Lincoln, the son of poor, ignorant parents, had educated himself and became the President of the United States. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller had begun as poor boys and had become two of the world's richest men. For those to whom such worldly success seemed momentarily denied, there was still the opportunity to share the experiences of these men vicariously through books. There were, for example, the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, a farm boy who had become president. Success Word, 1895, by Edward Boke, a poor boy who became one of America's great editors. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, In fiction, book after book extolled the possibilities. A man named Horatio Alger wrote more than 100 books and sold over 30 million copies of them about poor boys who, through luck and pluck, made it to the top, or at least part way. Such books usually made a strong case for the middle class virtues of thrift, hard work, prudence, honesty, and morality. And whatever the facts of the individual case, the general theme was uplift, along with feudalism had gone the feudal notion of the great chain of being. A man need no longer remain in the place where he had been born. He could raise himself by his own bootstraps if necessary. But Lincoln, Franklin, Polk, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Grant, and the heroes of Alger's books were white-skinned. What hope could their histories hold out to the more than 2 million members of that other ethnic group, which, after 1865, found itself free and often homeless in the land of opportunity? Torn and uprooted from intricate, well-organized economy patterns, from well-developed political systems, from complex cultures, the ex-African, provided he survived the cross-oceanic journey in the hellholes of the slave ships, found himself no longer a human being, a person, but instead an animal, a chattel to be bought and sold and taxed. Released from slavery, that is to say, released from his status as a chattel, as a piece of property, he yet found himself regarded as more animal than man, as something closer to the apes than to the angels. Without status, usually without education, often even with no role of any kind, even if he could read, what identification could he find with the heroes of the books his white neighbors were reading? There had, of course, been one hero whom the Negro might emulate. He was Frederick Douglass, 1817 to 1895, who had become a free Negro, a participant in the abolitionist movements, a counselor to presidents, a great orator. Douglass had argued for violence on the part of the Negro against the white. Blood must flow. Only the Negro's strong white arm would help the Negro earn that place in America to which he was rightfully entitled. For Negroes who could read or who could listen, there was Douglass's autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, written in 1882. But in the year in which Douglass died, a new Negro figure arose to capture the imaginations of his fellows and to become, until he died in 1915, the chief spokesman for the race. His rise came with an address which he gave at the exposition at Atlanta, Georgia. You will find it in chapter 14 of this book. In no time at all, he was in great demand all over the continent as a speaker, and soon editors and publishers were after him for his story. That story is the book before you. First appeared in print in an influential periodical, The Outlook, which at that time, as it was for 47 years, was being edited by the great liberal editor Lyman Abbott. The story was not the result of an essay gestation process. Washington had already completed one attempt at autobiography, the story of my life and work, and a disconnected collection of speeches, letters, and news stories, barely connected by a narrative. When pressed by Abbott for an autobiography to be serialized, he replied that he did not believe the events of his life would be of any interest to the public. pushed by Abbott and by Theodore Roosevelt as well, he dictated an essay of 3.5 pages and promised more the next day. The editors liked the simple, straightforward style and the promise of a true Horatio Alger kind of story. From rags to riches, from a dirt floored cabin to acceptance at the court of St. James, from slavery to a position as the nominal leader of his race. They kept after Washington, and he kept responding, writing in stolen fragments of time on odds and ends of paper. He was not happy with what he was doing, and his editors were unhappy too, and kept pointing out the gaps in chronology between chapters. After the story had been serialized in the Outlook, it was published in book form and immediately became a bestseller. Hundreds of thousands of copies were printed in English, and soon these were followed by copies in the Western European languages, in Hindustani, and some dozen other tongues as well, and even in Braille. Today, in a more cynical age, the reasons for its success may not be readily apparent, but readers of that time liked its plain revelations of intimate facts, its record of a triumph, of a will to overcome, and a spirit of perseverance over the most severe obstacles which must have ever faced a man. One thinks of Helen Keller, for instance. Its sense of immediacy. Washington was no remote figure out of the past, but a man whose career still had 15 years to run. Its spirit of unselfishness. Other books had recorded the success stories of men who had worked primarily to better their own conditions. Washington's autobiography was a record of the life of a man who had succeeded by helping others. In a way, it was a story of a man who had become one with Jesus and Saint Francis of Assisi. But shortly after publication, it became apparent that Up From Slavery was more of the record of the triumph of its author over the only true feudal system this continent has ever known. It was also the statement of the personal philosophies of the most influential Negro in the United States, or possibly the world. And it was over those philosophies that a battle soon raged, and it rages today wherever in the United States there's a concern over the relationships between Negroes and whites. What initiated Washington's critics, among whom was W.E.B. Du Bois, were these instances. His apparent willingness to fawn over middle and upper class whites because they were actual or possible contributors to his Tuskegee program. His Uncle Tom attitude towards his own race, as shown, for example, by this sample of Negro dialect. Oh Lord, the cotton done so grassy, the work on so hard, and the sun is so hot that I believe this darky am called to preach. I don't understand none of that shit, but whatever. His deprecatory attitude towards many Negro ministers, as shown in the above quotation, his attitudes of conciliation towards Southern whites, his refusal to demand social and political equality for all members of his race, though he enjoyed the former for himself, and his apparent anti-intellectualism as reflected in his efforts to train Negroes primarily in the mechanic skills and in his attitudes toward Negroes who pursued humanistic educations. One aspect of the criticism of Washington may be seen in this statement by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903. As a result of this tender of the palm branch, what has been the return? In those years since 1895, there have occurred 1. The disenfranchisement of the Negro. 2. The legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro. 3. the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of the Negro. These movements are not, to be sure, direct results of Mr. Washington's teachings, but his propaganda has, without a shadow of a doubt, helped their speedier accomplishment. Primarily, criticism of Washington stemmed from his 1895 Atlanta Exposition Address, particularly from passages such as these. As we have proved our loyalty to you in the past, in nursing your children, watching by the sick bed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them with tear-dimmed eyes to their graves, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives, if need be, in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours in a way that shall make the interests of both races one. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. Washington reported that as soon as he had finished his address, the governor of Georgia rushed across the platform to shake his hand. But a newspaper reporter wrote that the Negroes in the mixed audience were in tears, the implication being that they had been sold down the river once more, and this time by a member of their own race who had become accepted by their spokesman. The most severe of Washington's critics did not question his good faith, his unselfishness, his sincerity. I believe Booker T. Washington's heart is right, one critic wrote in 1906. But then he added, in fawning, cringing, and groveling before the white man, he has cost his race their rights, and that 20 years hence, as he looks back and sees the harm his course has done his race, he will be brokenhearted over it. Damn. Washington has his supporters, however. In general, they point out that given the time, the place, the conditions, Washington followed the best possible course. How many all-white American cities today, in 1967, would permit a Negro to come in and organize a school for Negroes along the lines of Tuskegee? Is one question put by his supporters. The reader of Up From Slavery will have to make choices to take a position. I know where I stand. My heart is with Booker T. Washington, but my brain is with Du Bois. Incidentally, the reader would like to see both sides of the situation is referred to Booker T. Washington and his critics, the problem of Negro leadership. Or he might turn to two biographies, Samuel R. Spencer Jr.'s Booker T. Washington and the Negro's Place in American Life, or Basil Matthews' Booker T. Washington. What happened to the man whose life story is only partially recorded in this book? He went on to build Tuskegee into an institution which had, at his death in 1915, over 100 well-equipped buildings, a faculty of almost 200 teaching nearly 40 trades and professions to more than 1,500 students, an endowment of some $2 million. He had traveled widely in Europe, where he recorded that he saw people living in conditions far worse than any in the United States. He had received an honorary Master's of Arts degree from Harvard. He had become one of the most influential Americans. His best is now in the Hall of Fame. If the American dream is now a thing of the past, at least it once existed. And Booker T. I'm going to try to pronounce his middle name. And Booker Taliaferro Washington, born a slave, a Negro, the humblest of the humble, once made that dream come true. And he did it by devotion to virtues which no longer are extolled so highly as they once were, the virtues of cleanliness, godliness, thrift, perseverance, hard work, and honesty. In all fairness, it must be asked, what have his detractors offered as a substitute for these rules of behavior? So this introduction was written by Clarence A. Andrews, Associate Professor of English, the Department of English at the University of Iowa, Iowa City, Iowa. Chapter 1, A Slave Among Slaves. I was born a slave on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. I'm not quite sure of the exact place or exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. As nearly as I have been able to learn, I was born near a crossroads post office called Hales Ford, and the year was 1858 or 1859. I do not know the month or the day. The earliest impressions I can now recall are of the plantation and the slave quarters, the latter being the part of the plantation where the slaves had their cabins. Could you imagine being on this earth and you just don't know what month or what day, and you barely know the year you were born? The fuck? My life had its beginning in the midst of the most miserable, desolate, and discouraging surroundings. This was so, however, not because my owners were especially cruel, for they were not, as compared with many others. I was born in a typical log cabin, about 14 by 16 feet square. In this cabin, I lived with my mother and a brother and a sister till after the Civil War, when we were all declared free. Of my ancestry, I know almost nothing. In the slave quarters, and even later, I heard whispered conversations among the colored people of the tortures which the slaves, including, no doubt, my ancestors on my mother's side, suffered in the middle passage of the slave ship while being conveyed from Africa to America. I have been unsuccessful in securing any information that would throw any accurate light upon the history of my family beyond my mother. She, I remember, had a half brother and a half sister. In the days of slavery, not very much attention was given to family history and family records, that is, black family records. My mother, I suppose, attracted the attention of a purchaser who was afterward my owner and hers. Y'all pardon me because the print is written very small, and I am 58 years old. Her addition to the slave family attracted about as much attention as the purchase of a new horse or cow. Mm-mm-mm. Of my father, I know even less than of my mother. I do not even know his name. I have heard reports to the effect that he was a white man who lived on one of the nearby plantations. Whoever he was, I never heard of his taking to the least interest in me or providing in any way for my rearing. But I do not find especial fault with him. He was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution which was the nation unhappily had engrafted upon it at that time. The cabin was not only our living place, but was also used as a kitchen for the plantation. My mother was the plantation cook. The cabin was without glass windows. It had only openings in the side which let in the light and also the cold, chilly air of winter. There was a door to the cabin, that is, something that was called a door, but the uncertain hinges by which it was hung and the large cracks in it to say nothing of the fact that it was too small, made the room a very uncomfortable one. In addition to these openings, there was in the lower right-handed corner of the room the cat hole, a contrivance which almost every mansion or cabin in Virginia possessed during the antebellum period. The cat hole was a square opening about 7 by 8 inches, provided for the purpose of letting the cat pass in and out of the house at will during the night. In the case of our particular cabin, I could never understand the necessity for this convenience, since there were at least a half dozen other places in the cabin that would have accommodated the cats. There was no wooden floor in our cabin, the naked earth being used as a floor. In the center of the earthen floor, there was a large, deep opening covered with boards, which was used as a place in which to store sweet potatoes during the winter. An impression of this potato hole is very distinctly engraved upon my memory, because I recall that during the process of putting the potatoes in or taking them out, I would often come into possession of one or two, which I roasted and thoroughly enjoyed. There was no cooking stove on our plantation, and all the cooking for the whites and slaves my mother had to do over an open fireplace, mostly in pots and skillets, while the poorly built cabin caused us to suffer with cold in the winter. The heat from the open fireplace in summer was equally trying. The early years of my life, which was spent in the little cabin, were not very different from those of thousands of other slaves. My mother, of course, had little time in which to give attention to the training of her children during the day. She snatched a few moments for our care in the early morning before her work began, and at night after the day's work was done. One of my earliest recollections is that of my mother cooking a chicken late at night and awakening her children for the purpose of feeding them. How or where she got it, I do not know. I presume, however, it was procured from our owner's farm. Some people may call this theft. If such a thing were to happen now, I should condemn it as theft myself. But taking place at the time it did, and for the reason that it did, no one could ever make me believe that my mother was guilty of thieving. She was simply a victim of the system of slavery. I cannot remember having slept in a bed until after our family was declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. 3 children: John, my older brother, Amanda, my sister, and myself, had a pallet on the dirt floor, or to be more correct, we slept in and on a bundle of filthy rags laid upon the dirt floor. I'm sorry, I'm just taking this all in, reading what his childhood was like. Figure 125, 130, 140 years ago. That's not too long ago. I was asked not long ago to tell something about the sports and pastimes that I engaged in during my youth. Until that question was asked, it had never occurred to me that there was no period of my life that was devoted to play. From the time I can remember anything, almost every day of my life has been occupied in some kind of labor, though I think I would now be a more useful man if I had time for sports. During the period that I spent in slavery, I was not large enough to be of much service. Still, I was occupied most of the time in cleaning the yards, carrying water to the men in the fields, or going to the mill, to which I used to take the corn once a week to be ground. The mill was about 3 miles from the plantation. This work I always dreaded. The heavy bag of corn would be thrown across the back of the horse, and the corn divided about evenly on each side. But in some way, almost without exception, on these trips, the corn would shift as to become unbalanced and would fall off the horse, and often I would fall with it. As I was not strong enough to reload the corn upon the horse, I would have to wait, sometimes for many hours, till a chance passerby came along who would help me out of my trouble. The hours while waiting for someone were usually spent in crying. The time consumed in this way made me late in reaching the mill, and by the time I got my corn ground and reached home, it would be far into the night. The road was a lonely one and often led through dense forests. I was always frightened. The woods were said to be full of soldiers who had deserted from the army, and I had been told that the first thing a deserter did to a Negro boy when he found him alone was to cut off his ears. Besides, when I was late in getting home, I knew I would always get a severe scolding or a flogging. I had no schooling whatsoever while I was a slave. Though I remember on several occasions I went as far as the schoolhouse door with one of my young mistresses to carry her books. The picture of several dozen boys and girls in the schoolroom engaged in study made a deep impression upon me, and I had the feeling that to get into a schoolhouse and study in this way would be about the same as getting into paradise. Mm. So far as I can now recall, the first knowledge that I got of the fact that we were slaves and that freedom of the slaves was being discussed was early one morning before day, when I was awakened by my mother kneeling over her children and fervently praying that Lincoln and his armies might be successful and that one day she and her children might be free. In this connection, I have never been able to understand how the slaves throughout the South, completely ignorant as were the masses so far as books or newspapers were concerned, were able to keep themselves so accurately and completely informed about the great national questions that were agitating the country. From the time that Garrison, Lovejoy, and others began to agitate for freedom, the slaves throughout the South kept in close touch with the progress of the movement. Though I was a mere child during the preparation for the Civil War and during the war itself, I now recall that many late at night whispered discussions that I heard my mother and other slaves on the plantation indulge in. These discussions showed that they understood the situation and that they kept themselves informed of events by what was termed the grapevine telegraph. During the campaign, when Lincoln was first a candidate for the presidency, the slaves on our far off plantation, miles from any railroad or large city or daily newspaper, knew what the issues involved were. When war was begun between the North and the South, every slave on our plantation felt and knew that, though other issues were discussed, the primal one was that of slavery. Even the most ignorant members of my race on the remote plantations felt in their hearts with a certainty that admitted of no doubt that the freedom of the slaves would be the one great result of the war if the Northern armies conquered. Every success of the Federal armies and every defeat of the Confederate forces was watched with the keenest and most intense interest. Often the slaves got knowledge of the results of the great battles before the white people received it. This news was usually gotten from the colored man who was sent to the post office for the mail. In our case, the post office was about 3 miles from the plantation, and the mail came once or twice a week. The man who was sent to the office would linger about the place long enough to get the drift of the conversation from the group of white people who naturally congregated there. After receiving their mail to discuss the latest news, the mail carrier, on his way back to our master's house, would as naturally retell the news that he had secured among the slaves, and in this way they often heard of important events before the white people at the big house, as the master's house was called. I cannot remember a single instance during my childhood or early boyhood when our entire family sat down at the table together and God's blessing was asked and the family ate a meal in a civilized manner. On the plantation in Virginia, and even later, meals were gotten by the children very much as dumb animals get theirs. It was a piece of bread here and a scrap of meat there. It was a cup of milk at one time and some potatoes at another. Sometimes a portion of our family would eat out of the skillet or pot, while someone would eat from a tin plate held on the knees, and often using nothing but their hands with which to hold the food. When I had grown to sufficient size, I was required to go to the big house at meal times to fan the flies from the table by means of a large set of paper fans operated by a pulley. Naturally, much of the conversation of the white people turned upon the subject of freedom in the war, and I absorbed a good deal of it. I remember that at one time I saw two of my young mistresses and some lady visitors eating ginger cakes in the yard. At that time, those cakes seemed to me to be absolutely the most tempting and desirable things I had ever seen. And I then and there resolved that if I ever got free, the height of my ambition would be reached if I could get to the point where I could secure and eat ginger cakes in the way that I saw those ladies doing. Of course, as the war prolonged, the white people, in many cases, often found it difficult to secure food for themselves. I think the slaves felt the deprivation less than the whites because the usual diet for the slaves was corn, bread, and pork, and these could be raised on the plantation. But coffee, tea, sugar, and other articles which the whites had been accustomed to use could not be raised on the plantation, and the conditions brought about by the war frequently made it impossible to secure these things. The whites were often in great straits. Parched corn was used for coffee, and a kind of black molasses was used instead of sugar. Many times nothing was used to sweeten the so-called tea and coffee. The pair of shoes that I recall wearing were wooden ones. They had rough leather on the top, but the bottoms, which were about an inch thick, were of wood. And when I walked, they made a fearful noise. And besides this, they were very inconvenient, since there was no yielding to the natural pressure of the foot. In wearing them, one presented an exceedingly awkward appearance. The most trying ordeal was that I was forced to endure as a slave boy, however, was the wearing of a flax shirt. In the portion of Virginia where I lived, it was common to use flax as part of the clothing for the slaves. That part of the flax from which our clothing was made was largely the refuse, which of course was the cheapest and roughest part. I can scarcely imagine any torture except perhaps the pulling of a tooth that is equal to that caused by putting on a new flax shirt for the first time. It is almost equal to feeling that one would experience if he had a dozen or more chestnut burrs or 100 small pinpoints in contact with his flesh. Even to this day, I can recall accurately the tortures that I underwent when putting on one of these garments. The fact that my flesh was soft and tender added to the pain, but I had no choice. I had to wear the flak shirt or none. And had it been left to me to choose, I should have chosen to wear no covering. In connection with the flak shirt, my brother John, who is several years older than I am, performed one of the most generous acts that I ever heard of one slave relative doing for another. On several occasions, when I was being forced to wear a new flak shirt, he generously agreed to put it on in my stead and wear it for several days till it was broken in. Until I had grown to be quite a youth, this single garment was all that I wore. Flax? The fuck? One may get the idea from what I have said that there was bitter feeling toward the white people on part of my race because of the fact that most of the white population was away fighting in a war which would result in keeping the Negro in slavery if the South was successful. In the case of the slaves on our place, this was not true, and it was not true of any large portion of the slave population in the South, where the Negro was treated with anything like decency. During the Civil War, one of my young masters was killed, and two were severely wounded. Good. I recall the feeling of sorrow which existed among the slaves when they heard of the death of Mars Billy. It was no sham sorrow, but real. Some of the slaves had nursed Mars Billy. Others had played with him when he was a child. Mars Billy had begged for mercy in the case of others when the overseer or master was thrashing them. The sorrow in the slave quarter was only second to that in the big house. When the two young masters were brought home wounded, the sympathy of the slaves was shown in many ways. They were just as anxious to assist in the nursing as the family relatives of the wounded. Some of the slaves would even beg for the privilege of sitting up at night to nurse their wounded masters. Master, we sick? The fuck? This tenderness and sympathy on the part of those held in bondage was a result of their kindly and generous nature. In order to defend and protect the women and children who were left on the plantations when the white males went to war, the slaves would have laid down their lives. The slave who was selected to sleep in the big house during the absence of the males was considered to have the place of honor. Anyone attempting to harm young mistress or old mistress during the night would have had to cross the dead body of a slave to do so. I do not know how many have noticed it, but I think that it will be found to be true that there are few instances, either in slavery or freedom, in which a member of my race has been known to betray a specific trust. As a rule, not only did members of my race entertain no feelings of bitterness against the whites before and during the war, but there are many instances of Negroes tenderly caring for their former masters and mistresses who, for some reason, have become poor and dependent since the war. I know of instances where the former masters of slaves have for years been supplied with money by their former slaves to keep them from suffering. I have known of still other cases in which the former slaves have assisted in the education of the descendants of their former owners. I know of a case on a large plantation in the South in which a young white man, the son of a former owner of the estate, had become so reduced in purse and self-control by reason of drink that he is a pitiable creature. And yet, notwithstanding the poverty of the colored people themselves on this plantation, they have for years supplied this young white man with the necessities of life. One sends him a little coffee or sugar, another a little meat, and so on. Nothing that the colored people possess is too good for the son of old Mars Tom, who will perhaps never be permitted to suffer while any remain on the place who knew directly or indirectly of old Mars Tom. Yeah, can I just take a break for a couple of minutes and just talk? Like I said, the print is very small, so I just gotta give my eyes a break for a few, if you don't mind. I don't get it, y'all. Did you hear what I was just reading? Even after slavery, colored folks were still taking care of these white people, making sure that they eat. Wow. But that was the nature of us. That's just how we got down. Treated so cruelly to the point that it's like I wouldn't be no better if I treated the white man just as bad as he's been treating me my whole life. And see, I talked about another video how we just so upstanding and dignified. I talked about in the movie Roots, the Next Generation, about this wicked old white man was whipping those niggas on their bare backs, tied to a tree. Even took a wife and tied her to the tree and gave the whip to her own husband and made him whip her. And at some point, the tables turned and they had the white man tied against the tree. After all the evil, wicked shit. And that very husband had the whip and threw the whip down on the ground and said, I refuse to treat you the same way you treated me, and walked away. Madam Whip ass ain't that dignified. Sorry. I don't even think I want to be. I'd have whipped that white man to the bone. I've said that there are a few instances of a member of my race betraying a specific trust. One of the best illustrations of this, which I know of, is in the case of an ex-slave from Virginia, whom I have met not long ago in a little town in the state of Ohio. I found that this man had made a contract with his master 2 or 3 years previous to the Emancipation Proclamation, to the effect that the slave was to be permitted to buy himself by paying so much per year for his body. And while he was paying for himself, he was to be permitted to labor where and for whom he pleased. Finding that he could secure better wages in Ohio, he went there. When freedom came, he was still in debt to his master for some $300. Notwithstanding that the Emancipation Proclamation freed him from any obligation to his master, this black man walked the greater portion of the distance back to where his old master lived in Virginia and placed the last dollar with interest in his hands. In talking to me about this, the man told me that he knew that he did not have to pay the debt, but that he had given his word to his master and his word he had never broken. He felt that he could not enjoy his freedom till he had fulfilled his promise. Y'all, that's the shit I'm talking about. You think after Emancipation Proclamation, Madam Whippass would have walked the better part from Ohio to Virginia to pay this man the last dollar with interest for my body? Is that something to be respected, admired? Is that what you call integrity? Because I have none of that. At least not in a situation like this. I said, man, fuck Massa. I'm free. And I ain't walking. And trains, buses, and planes have not been developed yet. So fuck them. But he could not enjoy his freedom until he had fulfilled his promise to this white man, even though he was free and had no obligation to pay him nothing. Is that integrity or is that conditioning by the white man? What say you? Let me know in the comments section. From some things I have said, one may get the idea that some of the slaves did not want freedom. This is not true. I have never seen one who did not want to be free or one who would return to slavery. Understand that this is an old book, and whoever had this, God knows how many years ago, it looks like they were reading this for school, so they made little notes and they're underlining shit and circling shit. So sometimes it's hard for me to see the word when you hear me stumbling. You know, sometimes they're underlining a passage or a sentence, and you know, the hand was unsteady, so it's going through the words. Just want to let you know that. So it says, I pity from the bottom of my heart any nation or body of people that is so unfortunate as to get entangled in the net of slavery. I have long since ceased to cherish any spirit of bitterness against the Southern white people on account of the enslavement of my race. No one section of our country was wholly responsible for its introduction, and besides it was recognized and protected for years by the general government. Having once got its tentacles fastened onto the economic and social life of the Republic, it was no easy matter for the country to relieve itself of the institution. Then, when we rid ourselves of prejudice or racial feeling and look facts in the face, we must acknowledge that, notwithstanding the cruelty and moral wrong of slavery, the 10 million Negroes inhabiting this country, who themselves or whose ancestors went through the school of American slavery, are in a stronger and more hopeful condition materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously than is true of an equal number of black people in any other portion of the globe. The person who had this book kind of underlined that passage, and in the space on the side of the paragraphs, they wrote problematic. This is so to such an extent that Negroes in this country, who themselves or whose forefathers went through the school of slavery, are constantly returning to Africa as missionaries to enlighten those who had remained in the fatherland. The fatherland. This I say not to justify slavery. On the other hand, I condemn it as an institution, as we all know that in America it was established for selfish and financial reasons and not from a missionary motive, but to call attention to a fact and to show how providence so often uses men and institutions to accomplish a purpose. When persons ask me in these days how, in the midst of what sometimes seem hopelessly discouraging conditions, I can have such faith in the future of my race in this country, I remind them of the wilderness through which and out of which a good providence had already led us. Ever since I have been old enough to think for myself, I have entertained the idea that, notwithstanding the cruel wrongs inflicted upon us, the black man got nearly as much out of slavery as the white man did. The hurtful influences of the institution were not by any means confined to the Negro. This was fully illustrated by the life upon our own plantation. The whole machinery of slavery was so constructed as to cause labor, as a rule, to be looked upon as a badge of degradation, of inferiority. Hence, labor was something that both races on the slave plantation sought to escape. The slave system on our place, in a large measure, took the spirit of self-reliance and self-help out of the white people. My old master had many boys and girls, but not one, so far as I know, ever mastered a single trade or special line of productive industry. The girls were not taught to cook, sew, or to take care of the house. All of this was left to the slaves. The slaves, of course, had little personal interest in the life of the plantation, and their ignorance prevented them from learning how to do things in the most improved and thorough manner. As a result of the system, fences were out of repair, gates were hanging half off the hinges, doors creaked, window panes were out, plastering had fallen but was not replaced, weeds grew in the yard. As a rule, there was food for whites and blacks, but inside the house and on the dining room table, there was wanting that delicacy and refinement of touch and finish which could make a home the most convenient, comfortable, and attractive place in the world. Withal, there was a waste of food and other materials, which was sad. When freedom came, the slaves were almost as well fitted to begin life anew as the master, except in the matter of book learning and ownership of property. The slave owner and his sons had mastered no special industry. They unconsciously had imbibed the feeling that manual labor was not the proper thing for them. On the other hand, the slaves in many cases had mastered some handicraft, and none were ashamed, and few unwilling to labor. Finally, the war closed, and the day of freedom came. It was a momentous and eventful day to all upon our plantation. We had been expecting it. Freedom was in the air and had been for months. Deserting soldiers returning to their homes were to be seen every day. Others who had been discharged or whose regiments had been paroled were constantly passing near our place. The grapevine telegraph was kept busy day and night. The news and mutterings of great events was swiftly carried from one plantation to another. In the fear of Yankee invasions, the silverware and other valuables were taken from the big house, buried in the woods, and guarded by trusted slaves. Woe be to anyone who would have attempted to disturb the buried treasure. The slaves would give the Yankee soldiers food, drink, clothing, anything but that which had been specifically entrusted to their care and honor. As the great day drew nearer, there was more singing in the slave quarters than usual. It was bolder, had more ring, and lasted later into the night. Most of the verses of the plantation songs had become reference to freedom. True, they had sung those same verses before, but they had been careful to explain that the freedom in these songs referred to the next world and had no connection with life in this world. Now they gradually threw off the mask and were not afraid to let it be known that the freedom in their songs meant freedom of the body in this world. The night before the eventful day, word was sent to the slave quarters to the effect that something unusual was going to take place at the big house the next morning. There was little, if any, sleep that night. All was excitement and expectancy. Early the next morning, word was sent to all the slaves, old and young, to gather at the house. In company with my mother, brother, and sister, and a large number of other slaves, I went to the master's house. All of our master's family were either standing or seated on the veranda of the house, where they could see what was to take place and hear what was said. There was a feeling of deep interest, or perhaps sadness, on their faces, but not bitterness. As I now recall the impression they made upon me, they did not at any moment seem to be sad because of the loss of property, but rather because of parting with those whom they had reared and who were in many ways very close to them. The most distinct thing that I now recall in connection with this scene was that some man who seemed to be a stranger, a United States officer, I presume, made a little speech and then read a rather long paper, the Emancipation Proclamation, I think. And after the reading, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day for which she had been longing, so long praying, but fearing that she would never live to see. For some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. The wild rejoicing on part of the emancipated colored people lasted for but a brief period, for I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabin, there was a change in their feelings. Yeah, it's gonna make you mad, James. Oh, Lord. The great responsibility of being free or having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children, seemed to take possession of them. It was very much like suddenly turning a youth of 10 or 12 years out into the world to provide for himself. In a few hours, the great question with which the Anglo Saxon race had been grappling for centuries had been thrown upon these people to be solved. There were the questions of a home, a living, the rearing of children, education, citizenship, and the establishment and support of churches. Was it any wonder that within a few hours the wild rejoicing ceased and a feeling of deep gloom seemed to pervade the slave quarters? To some, it seemed that now that they were in actual possession of it, freedom was a more serious thing than they had expected to find it. For some of the slaves were 70 or 80 years old. Their best days were gone. They had no strength with which to earn a living in a strange place among strange people, even if they had been sure where to find a new place of abode. To this class, the problem seemed especially hard. Besides, deep down in their hearts, there was a strange and peculiar attachment to old master and old missus, and to their children, which they found it hard to think of breaking off. With these, they had spent in some cases nearly a half century, and it was no light thing to think of parting. Gradually, one by one, stealthily at first, the older slaves began to wander from the slave quarters back to the big house to have a whispered conversation with their former owners as to the future. All right, that concludes chapter one of From Slavery. I don't know. The conditioning is just too profound for me. You know how they thought, how they viewed things. I'm talking about the slaves. Um, just conditioned. And so, as I was reading, is two things I came across. Number one, you know, the Northerners won, thus the slaves were freed. And now, today in 2025, you got a Northerner that is ushering us back into slavery. Please don't think that I'm being extreme, because I am not. I'm looking at these farmers in Texas, in Florida, in Georgia. Some of these people the farm has been in their family for 300 years. They have lost their farm because overnight, 100% of their workforce disappeared. Whether they were uh, kidnapped by ICE, or they just scared to come to work in fear of being kidnapped by ICE. And so there's no one working these farms. These farmers are angry at Trump. They regret their vote. But I heard Trump say the other day to the farmers, just be patient, hold on, it's gonna get better. Help is on its way. That's what he said. He said it's gonna hurt a little while. It's gonna hurt a little bit, but it's gonna get better. How is it gonna get better? He's gonna let the immigrants come back to the fields? No. Somebody gotta work these fields. And ain't nothing changed from what we just read in this book in chapter 1. White folks lazy, unskilled. The way I see it, I think in Trump's demented mind, he's intended for all of us to go back out on these fields. And the farmers will be happy and will kiss Trump's feet, because now they don't even have to pay for labor. We'll be back in these fields on the farms. I wonder what living conditions they will provide for us. Will they build cabins with no floors, dirt floors, and we gotta lay rags on the dirt floor like Booker T washing and sleep on top of? Or will they build cabins and provide air conditioning and shit? Will the improvement of would the life of the slave be improvement in some ways? I mean, will we have furniture? Will they give us nice furniture in our cabins? I'm wondering. Will a plantation might have 2 or 3 structures, like a guest house and stuff? Will they cram like 20 niggas in one 2-bedroom guest house? If the AC breaks down, will they care enough about us in the hot Georgia heat to get it fixed? But hey, one of the slaves, I'm talking about slaves of 2026, 2027, 2028, maybe they were HVAC technicians and they'll be able to fix the AC for us. Isn't that special? I was thinking at one time that, we'll be farming next to Beyonce and Jay-Z be on another plantation in another state. We'll be farming with Janet Jackson, celebrities, Obama, Michelle, and their daughters. You don't think that's possible, huh? You think I got a wild imagination? Well, to tell you the truth, people like Beyonce, Janet Jackson, Janet don't even live in America anymore. But with their money, they can go live in Europe or someplace. But who knows? Perhaps Trump, and he would do it, establish some sort of treaty or something, deport every American out of your countries back here. We own them. That is our property. Thus, we'll be slaving right alongside of Beyonce and Janet, Megan Thee Stallion, Cardi B. What say you? What say you? Is my thinking outrageously far fetched? Or could you yourself see this happening? And if you can see this happening, what solutions do you have to prevent this? I haven't gotten that far to think of a solution just yet. I'm going to get there though. Anyway, thanks for tuning in and listening. Peace. I'm out.